Hi, everybody. This is Eric Murray from the sugarhuddle.com, doing another video today. Every week I'm previewing a division. I'm previewing every single team, but I'm doing week by week with the divisions. Last week I did the AFC West, and this week I'm doing the NFC East. So this is a video kind of recapping those articles that are on the sugarhuddle.com, and remember to go to that website and check it out. But anyways, NFC East, it's interesting because in a lot of ways you could say it's actually the NFC least, and it's really not a knock necessarily on the division as much as the fact that the NFC is just so good. The AFC's, but the NFC is a really, really strong conference top to bottom, and in a lot of ways you could say that the East is actually the worst of the four divisions, and in a way, it could also be of its own doing because there's a possibility that three teams in that division could end up having losing records. I actually have two predicted to have losing records, and it's the same two teams from last year. We'll get to that in a minute. But, first of all, you have the defending world champion Philadelphia Eagles. Everybody wants to know, are they going to be the next NFL dynasty? I mean, every single decade throughout the NFL's history, for all the parity, even historically, we've seen in the NFL, there's always one dynasty every single decade. And sometimes there's even a couple dynasties in a given decade. But you think about the 60s Packers, 70s Steelers, the 80s Niners, the 90s Cowboys, and really the Patriots since 2001. There really hasn't been any other true dynasty other than the Patriots, and they could easily be the team of the decade again this decade. But Philly still has a couple more years left in this decade to win another championship and carry that momentum into the 2020s. And, it's interesting with them because, here's this team that shows that you can win a Super Bowl without an elite quarterback. They had an elite quarterback in Carson Wentz, and then all of a sudden, he goes down. I think it was week 13 against the Rams. And then you got Nick Foles, who had that Pro Bowl season several years ago in 2013 with the Eagles. But generally speaking, he's been a journeyman, and he's been a backup for a reason. And he comes in, and there were some bumps at the end of the regular season, but then he tears it up in the postseason, and they're Super Bowl champions. And it just shows how good of a team they have because, they had a great defense all year. And in the Super Bowl, they weren't so great, but when the defense needed to step up, they stepped up, and that's the true heart of a champion. And obviously one of the big motivators last year for the Eagles, Lane Johnson and company started the whole underdog thing, and they started wearing the dog mask and all that stuff. But now they're no longer the underdogs. They're no longer the hunters. They're the hunted. And it's interesting, the pressure that builds on you when you go from being, this upstart team that wins a Super Bowl to now everybody expects you to win all the time. And certainly in Philly, where it's their first Super Bowl championship, but the people in Philly, I mean, they're going to be expecting a lot of this now. This is going to be a given. There's going to be complacency, and there's going to be probably some complacency amongst the players. So keeping that hunger, keeping that drive is going to be a big factor in whether the Eagles can repeat as Super Bowl champions. And obviously trying to win the division first and foremost is a big step towards that next step of trying to get back to the Super Bowl. But, now they have to find a new way to motivate themselves. And, you think about the Seahawks from a few years ago, they build this team up and have this really nice year in 2012. Then all of a sudden they won Super Bowl in 2013, should have won it again in 2014, blew it obviously, but there was a lot of pressure and there's a lot of expectations. And even in 2014, when they got back to the Super Bowl and, like I said, should have won it, there was a lot of bumps just to get to that Super Bowl. And every year since then, it's kind of been a downward spiral for the Seahawks. And, you look at the Eagles, you just wonder, do they still have that motivation? Do they still have that heart to keep this thing going? And I think they do. I think they have the right kind of guys in the locker room. I think they have the right coach and Doug Peterson. I think they have the right kind of football team. But as far as this season, it's a whole new ball game, and you obviously want to see, can Foles continue his momentum from the end of last year, because nobody really knows when Carson Wentz is officially going to be back. You figure week 13, that was, I believe, November, that would have been when he tore his ACL. So if he comes back, September, whatever the opener is, the 7th or whatever the exact day is, I mean, you're talking, 10 months, something like that. So it's like, I don't know. I mean, I know a lot of people from things I've heard that he's, on schedule and everything else, and even in some ways ahead of schedule, but still expecting him back week 1. And I've heard rumors that he might, miss like maybe the first 3 or 4 games of the regular season. So, obviously if you're the Eagles, that's going to be key to see, how the season starts. And, with Wentz himself, you see a lot of these guys, these quarterbacks that tear their ACLs, and then they're kind of a little bit off that first season back. You think about Carson Palmer, in that playoff game against the Steelers in the 05 season, and, trying to bounce back from that the next year. And he was kind of skittish. He was a little bit off. We saw, RG3, who had an ACL injury in college and another ACL injury at the end of his rookie year with the Redskins, and then he was never the same. Part of that was he just didn't really, continue to improve and develop his game, but still, nonetheless, he was off that next year. And so it's just kind of one of those deals that, you do worry about that, but they just have such a deep team, and a lot of that you have to credit to Howie Roseman. One of the things I mentioned in the article on the sugarhuddle.com is, Howie Roseman's kind of like a mad genius when you think about some of the things he was able to do this offseason. I mean, Michael Bennett, I know he's a distraction and Seattle needed to get rid of him, but they didn't really give up a whole lot to get him, and now he's got to bolster what's already perhaps the best defensive line in football. So that pass rush is just going to get nastier, and he's going to have a new motivation, of course. I know, they made that one trade in the draft, and they were able to pick up some picks there, and they give a fifth-year option to Nelson Aguilar, who a lot of people thought was kind of a bust his first couple years, and then he really came on. They traded away Torrey Smith, but I think a lot of people kind of didn't expect him to be around long-term. They gave Alshon Jeffrey, a long-term deal along the way. Made a lot of nice veteran moves. Mike Wallace, a lot of people are kind of chilly on him, but it's a 1-year deal. There's not a whole lot of risk there. I think Haloti Ngata was another guy that they brought in, another guy who's over the hill, but still kind of a low-risk deal. So, they're kind of bringing in some guys for the hell of it to bolster their depth. They really haven't gotten rid of a whole lot of people. And they're across the board offensively and defensively. I mean, they're a pretty unstoppable force. The draft itself, they didn't make any real splash moves, but they brought in some quality players, and that's all they really have to do. I mean, they're in a position where they don't need a whole lot of instant production from young guys. They just need guys who can learn their system and step up and kind of build that depth. But at any rate, I think the Eagles will take a minor step back this year. I'll wait until right before the season to do my playoff predictions. But one thing I will say now is I don't have the Eagles repeating as Super Bowl champs. But I think they're going to go 12-4, and I do have them winning the NFC East. I just think that, you look at the rest of the division, it's a competitive division when you think about when they play one another head-to-head, but it's a winnable division. I mean, they can beat Dallas, they can handle New York, they can handle Washington. So I just think the Eagles are still the class of the division. They're still going to be one of the best teams in football. And I think if Foles does have to play the first few weeks, I think he'll handle his business, and I think he'll be fine. But I do think that maybe they will just take a slight step back, just because trying to replicate that championship success that next year, it's hard to repeat. But even beyond the repeating, even if they do wind up repeating, it's just that next year after you win the championship, you're usually not better. There's always something that happens. But when you look at the team they have right now, I mean, I do have to say, despite my prediction, it's hard to say that they're going to regress. But again, there is going to be certain things you wonder with the motivation factor. But I think they'll be plenty motivated. Again, Wentz is going to come back, and he's going to probably be a little bit skittish at first. And that's not questioning his toughness or anything. It's just that's kind of what happens when these quarterbacks come back from injuries like that. And you wonder how that kind of is going to throw off the balance a little bit. And, he's going to be dealing with his own pressure. One thing I didn't mention in the article, he's going to be dealing with his own pressure because because it was Foles that actually won the Super Bowl. Now everybody's gonna be like, well, Carson, I mean, you're this great quarterback. You were probably going to win MVP last year before the injury. You have to win the Super Bowl now, and you have to do it this year. So Wentz is going to have that extra pressure, and that could be a little bit tough. But nonetheless, I still see Philly taking this thing. Looking at the Cowboys, the thing I mentioned in the article was they're just a soap opera. They're a drama every single year, but they're kind of that soap opera that's been on forever, and it's the same old tired storylines, and you're like, okay, they kind of need to change it up, because this was another off season, and granted, it wasn't as dramatic as probably off seasons in the past, but you look at it and you say, you know what, they had a lot of holes coming in the off season. They really didn't do anything to get any better, and you're kind of putting a lot of faith in Jason Garrett and Dak Prescott to turn this thing around. And there's a lot of people that really don't believe in Garrett and thought he should have been fired by now. And then, of course, Dak Prescott. A lot of people, he's coming into his third year in the league, and a lot of people don't know what to make of him. So I think with Dallas, there's some people that think that they're going to get back to the playoffs this year. They're going to bounce back from last year and could even win the division. But realistically, I'm still not much of a believer in Dak. And I think with Jason Garrett, I just think that Jerry Jones is a guy that, for as much as he's a businessman, he can be very loyal to a fault. And Jason Garrett has been one of his guys for a long time, dating back to obviously when Garrett was Troy Aikman's backup quarterback in Dallas several years back. So, you wonder, is it going to get to a point where Jerry's going to have to say, okay, I can't do this anymore? And, the possibility maybe even Jason Garrett gets fired during the season. I don't see it happening. I think he'll definitely survive the season. But I just think with Dallas, you have all these distractions. You cut Des Bryant, which was a great move. You definitely need to do that. But he's still mouthing off. And now there's Cowboys players that, are having to answer these questions at the beginning of training camp. So it's not really a great start to training camp from that regard, because some unnecessary drama. But a lot of people say they may have had, possibly the worst draft this year, and it's hard for me to argue against that. Leighton Vander Esch, I don't know. I understand, the hype surrounding him and the talent and everything, but I don't think he's really a thumper, and I don't know I know Dallas kind of has that Boise State pipeline with a lot of the Boise State guys they brought in recent years, but I don't know. Not real blown away by him, and I think that they could have done a little bit better there, and maybe they could have gotten somebody better in second or third round, but really wasn't that crazy about that pick. They passed up on some really good receivers, Calvin Ridley, DJ Moore. The guy who's actually my favorite in the draft receiver-wise was Christian Kirk from Texas A&M. He ended up going to the Cardinals. I think it was 47th overall. It might have been sooner than that, but it was definitely in the second round. But at any rate, I thought the Cowboys passed up on a lot of terrific receivers. There were some other defensive players that were pretty good looking that they passed up on. So, it sounds like the Cowboys were all in on him leading up to the draft, and if they feel that strongly, that's great. And they have had some success with these Boise State guys. But I don't know, Leighton Vander Esch, it reminds me a little bit of the last, kind of big-time Boise State defender coming out of the draft, Shea McClellan, who went in the first round, I think that was 2012 or 2013, I think it was 2012, to the Bears. And he was a guy, he was actually more of a defensive end in college, and then they kind of moved him to linebacker in Chicago. But he was a guy that got all this hype and everything, and then he just didn't turn out to be anything. And, Vander Esch could certainly prove me wrong, but, playing the Mountain West, I mean, I don't know. You think about Boise State as good as a team that they've had, you still kind of think about the offensive side of the ball first and foremost in an offensive-minded conference. But we'll see what happens with that pick. But I don't know if that is the guy that's going to really put them over the top defensively or not. I'm still not really sold on him. We'll see what happens as far as his NFL career. But then in the second round, you draft Connor Williams out of Texas, and this is a guy who was a good-looking prospect a couple years ago, but some were kind of saying that maybe he's a little bit overrated. And then last year, he comes out and he gets his butt kicked against Maryland, and then he got his butt kicked against USC before he goes down with an injury. And then I think he came back late in the year, but didn't get a whole lot better. One thing that's really a concern with Williams is that he's a little bit too kind of soft. He needs to add more strength, more upper body strength. He gets pushed around too much. I've heard a couple people actually say he might be like another Luke Jokel, and that's obviously not a good thing because Jokel, of course, second overall pick by the Jaguars in I think 2013, I believe that was. He was a total bust, and he's bounced around the league a little bit, got moved to guard, and was still a disaster. Williams was actually announced as a guard when he was drafted, which is kind of interesting. So I think Dallas kind of realizes some of his limitations. And the nice thing is he doesn't have to start right away, but nonetheless, there's a chance with some of the injuries that Dallas has suffered lately that he could be starting pretty early on and could be a big factor this upcoming season. But it wasn't real crazy about him coming out of Texas. At least they didn't draft him in the first round. They drafted him, mid-second round, so that's not too bad. But wasn't inspired by that pick. And again, they passed up on some other pretty good defensive players and a couple good receivers along the way. DJ Chark from LSU that I really liked. And then Michael Gallup, Colorado State receiver, they took later on in the third round. The problem is they cut Dez, and like I said, I think for various reasons it was good that they cut Dez, but one of the issues with Dez is that he, struggles to kind of create separation and has some speed issues. And that's kind of something that a lot of people say with Michael Gallup. So there are better receiver options there. They haven't really had a true number one receiver for several years, and I think they're still lacking a number one guy. And you look at what they did in the offseason. They traded for Tavon Austin, and he was a guy I really liked coming out of college, but total bust with the Rams, way overpaid, not very productive. And even last year with Sean McVay, they didn't use him much. They just knew, And the Cowboys, they say they kind of want to use him as a little bit of a hybrid, like he's been used throughout his career as an offensive weapon. But right now he's projected to start ahead of Cole Beasley in the slot, and I think Cole Beasley is a much better player at this point. And I don't think you gain anything out of getting Tavon Austin. We'll see with Michael Gallup, but I'm not real blown away with that pickup. And then they got a guy from the Bears who has been kind of a journeyman, player at best. That really hasn't done much. So, I have a lot of concerns with Dak, but I have to say at the same time, Dallas isn't really doing anything to help him out. I mean, they've got the great running back in Elliott, and when healthy, their line is as good as any, but receiving core is definitely doing him no favors. And with Dak himself, he's a guy that a big concern I have with him is he's just not somebody who can put the team on his back and carry him to victory, even when his receivers are playing well. Some of the decision making, sometimes he gets a little intimidated as far as throwing down the field, even though he has the arm strength, and then kind of tries to check down a little bit. And sometimes he misses reads and has bad interceptions. And last year, obviously he had a lot more interceptions than he did the year before. I think he has four as a rookie, and last year I think it was 11 or 13, something like that. I think it was 11. But I just felt like last year there were too many times where he had just truly bad throws, and he had a pick six against the Seahawks that was especially bad, and that was definitely a crucial play in that game. But even without Dez and another thing in the offseason, by the way, Jason Witten waited till after the draft to retire, which is certainly totally in his right, but Dallas completely dropped the ball on trying to find a successor. So, Dallas is kind of, they did bring in Schultz from Stanford. They took him in the fourth round, and Stanford has a good track record of tight ends in recent years, but nonetheless, he's a fourth round player. We'll see what happens there. Rico Gathers, guy that they liked out of Baylor, former basketball player. But he's another guy that, is a project type guy and hasn't done anything in the NFL yet. Jeff Swaim, projected starter for now, is basically a blocking tight end. So, you add these things together, and it definitely doesn't help Dez, but Dallas, has dropped the ball on drafting tight ends for the last several years. So, there's been some issues there personnel-wise, but Dak himself, again, can't put the team on his back. Questionable decision making, and you wonder, is Dallas kind of secretly thinking even though it does seem like Jerry Jones is high on Dak, you wonder if Dallas is kind of secretly thinking maybe we bring back Jason Garrett for this year and see what him and Dak do in year 3 to salvage this thing, get us back to the playoffs. And if they both fail, then there's a possibility that we could just find somebody to replace both of them. And, it's almost kind of like with Tampa. You wonder with Dirk Cutter and Jameis Winston, Cincinnati with Marvin Lewis and Andy Dalton, are these teams thinking we're going to ride it out one more year with our quarterback coach combination, and if this goes under, then we're gonna have to move on from both guys. So Dak would certainly still be on the roster next year, but you do wonder if he really takes another step back, what it could mean for his future. But nonetheless, I have questions about if he's really truly the guy, and if he can really put the team on his back. Having Ezekiel Elliott for 16 games definitely helps, but nonetheless, you've got a defense that it's been said over and over again how crucial Sean Lee is, and you see it firsthand. I mean, I think through the first 8 games last year, Lee had missed 2, and they gave up 35 points per game in those 2 games. And in the 6 he played, they only gave up 17, and the yardage per game and all those other stats reflected that. And then he missed 3 games the second half of the season, and again, Cowboys defense struggled mightily without him, and they continue to be bad. And then David Irving, second year in a row, really talented pass rusher, but gets suspended again for substance abuse issues. You have DeMarcus Lawrence, and you got him on the franchise tag, and he's a heck of a player. But Dallas's pass rush is way too inconsistent, and then you have a lot of these guys that are unavailable. Linebacker wise, we'll have to see what Van Der Esch does, but Sean Lee's 31 now, and he doesn't particularly stay healthy very often. Jalen Smith out of Notre Dame, he still really hasn't fully recovered, even a few years later from that injury he suffered at Notre Dame. You lost Anthony Hitchens to the Chiefs, so that was another crucial reason that you needed to get Van Der Esch, because you were already thin at linebacker and you just got thinner. And then secondary wise, you still have guys like Jeff Heath, and Byron Jones is the best of the bunch, but even he's just kind of a okay player. Heath is below average, and these young corners are pretty below average. So generally speaking, Dallas, I have them going 9-7, and I think like last year, they'll miss the playoffs at 9-7. Just hard to trust Dallas, and we saw for a number of years, even when Romo was there, they'd have these 8-8 seasons, and they'd have all these late season meltdowns where they'd really blow it in December, and I haven't really seen them completely break out of that mold yet, despite what they did a couple years ago. And I just think that even with some of the positives, with what their pass rush can be at times, and maybe their linebacking core gets a lot better, and Lee stays a lot healthier. But even with some of those positives, I just think the lack of depth, and I think there's more and more of a lack of confidence in Jason Garrett. So I just think, all things considered, I think Dallas settles for 9-7. I just think that's kind of where they're at. I just think they're a kind of average to maybe slightly above average football team. Wouldn't be surprised if they actually end up with a losing record. And then I mentioned there was 2 teams in the division that had a losing record last year. Of course, that was the Redskins and the Giants, and I think it's going to continue again. Redskins, they finished 7-9 last year. They're hoping that some of the changes they made this offseason and a much healthier roster will help, and it definitely could, and they definitely could make a run at 9 or 10 wins. But I have them going 7-9 again. I just don't really think, I like Alex Smith, but I just don't think he's an upgrade over Kirk Cousins at all. And you got to realize, he's a few years older than Cousins. He's 5 years older than Cousins. So he's like 34, and Cousins is 29. So he's like basically 5 years older. And, you look at his career, I mean, for all the good things he can do, deadly accurate, doesn't turn the ball over, a lot of that's because he doesn't have a very good arm, so he's just constantly checking down. So that kind of limits your offense even further. And when you're already a football team that can't run the ball particularly well at all, now you have this limited quarterback who, has struggled to put the team on his back throughout his career, has struggled to come up big in the big moments. Remember, that's one of the knocks on Cousins. So you just kind of look at the Redskins. They've been kind of a two steps forward, one step back, or one step forward, two steps back, either or type of team throughout really the whole Dan Snyder era since he bought that team about 20 years ago. So they just feel like a team that they're kind of going nowhere, and they still play hard for Jay Gruden, but you wonder if Jay Gruden, one playoff appearance in his first 4 years, losing record, his defense has continued to regress, injured or not, since he came over there. Their best year defensively was 2014, his first year, and that's because he inherited a lot of Mike Shanahan guys, and they've gotten just progressively worse, again, regardless of whether they've been healthy or injured. And then the running game has been atrocious. Now, Darius Geis was a great draft pick in the second round, and he could be arguably the best running back in this draft, even above Saquon Barkley and some of these other guys. But nonetheless, this is a team that just can't consistently run the ball. And Jay Gruden, if you're going to have Alex Smith as your quarterback, looking at his track record, especially last 6, 7, 8 years, he needs a strong running game, and he needs a strong defense to thrive. He's that kind of guy, kind of like we saw with Case Keenum last year in Minnesota. That strong running game, that strong defense allowed him to thrive, and that's also a concern some people might have with Baker Mayfield, is maybe that's what he needs to do to thrive. But going back to Alex Smith, he has mobility unlike Cousins, and that is definitely going to help. Definitely going to help the running game to a certain extent. But again, if Jay Gruden wants to continue to throw the ball 40 times a game, then they're not going anywhere. So a significantly improved running game will definitely help them quite a bit. But I still think there's a lot of limitations to Alex Smith's game, and even though he'll turn over a lot less than Cousins, who wasn't really a turnover machine, but still significantly less turnovers. And he'll have pretty decent weapons. I'm still wondering, is Washington, especially with their defense, if they're going to have to play from behind a lot in the fourth quarter, they have no shot of getting to the playoffs. And, when you look at that defense, both sides of the ball in general, I think there was like 23 guys who finished the regular season on the IR, and several of them had spent several weeks on the IR, and especially defensive guys. But, you lost Kendall Fuller in free agency. Josh Norman hasn't lived up to expectations since he came to Washington. You signed Orlando Scandrick away from Dallas, which is a guy that Dallas would love to still have, but like Josh Norman, his production hasn't been nearly what it once was. Norman didn't have a single interception last year. Part of that's because teams try to kind of avoid throwing his way, and he plays in a certain system where he kind of plays on one side of the field, kind of like Richard Sherman was doing in Seattle. But Orlando Scandrick only had like one pick, and I think he missed like 5 games due to injury. Had some durability issues off and on in recent years. So you've got 2 guys, starting corners, that are getting pretty good money, and they're both just over 30 years old now, and you just wonder, you've got decent safeties, not amazing, but decent safeties. Older corners, this is a team that's really struggled with takeaways in the last few years. One of the many categories defensively where they've really been deficient, where they've really struggled. And then, you just, I don't know. I don't really love that secondary too much. Having Zach Brown back, obviously, is definitely going to be a big boost. He missed, I think it was the last few games of the regular season. Mason Foster is a decent linebacker. And then that pass rush, is going to be strong because you got Ryan Kerrigan, and you have Preston Smith. But nonetheless, I still, wonder about this team, and I wonder, this defense. They struggled against the run, not much better against the pass, and with a quarterback who you basically need a lead going to the fourth quarter of any given game, it's just not a real great combination. So I think Jay Gruden's capable of being a good coach, and at times he's been, but I do wonder if this is kind of the end of the line for him. And so it's one of those deals that I think, you gave Alex Smith this big contract extension after you traded for him, and so you're obviously married to him for the next several years. But I don't think he's really an upgrade over Cousins, and I don't know how much better the defense is going to be. And again, with Smith's limitations and knowing that, again, not to sound like a broken record, but the fact that he's not a particularly clutch quarterback, I just look at it and I think that maybe this is the end of the line for Gruden, and I think they're going to repeat what they did last year. I think they're going to be 7-9 again, and they'll be close, to getting those 9th and 10th wins. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to settle for 7-9. They're still going to struggle, I think, within the division, and I don't know, just not really feeling the Redskins. And then finally, you look at the Giants. Everything that could go wrong last year definitely did, and this is a proud franchise. They set a franchise record for losses. They finished 3-13 last year. Ben McAdoo all of a sudden forgot how to coach after leading them to the playoffs in 2016, and he should have been fired a lot sooner than he was last season. Even though I think he was right in benching Eli Manning if he had like a real plan to have Davis Webb, the rookie, play the rest of the year. He totally screwed that up, and he played Geno Smith for some reason, and then he was fired after that decision, and then Steve Spagnuolo promised that Eli would play the rest of the year, and that's what happened. So it's just been totally dysfunctional in New York, and you had these defensive players getting suspended, particularly defensive backs. Eli Apple, surprisingly, is still on the roster, but you wonder for how long. They cut Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie, and then Janoris Jenkins can be a head case. He's a heck of a football player, though, but he's another guy who served a one-game suspension. So they've got a lot of dysfunction defensively, got a lot of holes. They got some issues with linebacker, issues with their pass rush. A lot of people thought maybe they'd take Bradley Chubb out of NC State. They took Saquon Barkley instead. They traded away Jason Pierre-Paul in the offseason to Tampa. And Olivier Vernon didn't really have a great year last year, and now he's getting like something like $17 million this year. He's a pretty big cap hit, and he really hasn't produced enough. But they're moving back to a 3-4 for the first time in a long time, and that's going to be an interesting transition. And their new defensive coordinator was a guy from Arizona who was really, I think his name is James Betcher, but he's a guy who's really big on takeaways and sacks and things like that. So that would be great for them in the long run. But that first year, you're switching around to a 3-4 scheme. Apparently, they're going to try to rotate 7 or 8 defensive linemen, and that's a good thing to keep them fresh. But again, that first year, and you still have some holes in the middle of your defense, and you still have some question marks about your secondary outside of Landon Collins, because some of these guys are, again, some of them are head cases, and you just want, and then Eli Apple still has to prove that he can play in this league because he's been a bust to this point. And then offensively, you think about Eli Manning. I mean, this is a guy that's kind of been done for years, and obviously, having Odell Beckham for an entire season this year and knowing that he's trying to play for a new contract is huge. Dave Gettleman, the new GM, who did a great job in Carolina and shouldn't have gotten fired, and certainly shouldn't have gotten replaced by the previous GM, Marty Herney, who's back in Carolina, is going to completely screw up their cap situation again, but that's another story. Gettleman had a nice offseason, and he did a great job, bringing in Nate Solder from the Patriots. Now you have that left tackle of the future. Now you get to move Eric Flowers back to more of his true position of right tackle. And then you draft Will Hernandez, the guard out of UTEP. He's going to be your starting left guard, projected starting left guard right now. So all of a sudden, that's a much stronger looking offensive line. And so you have to give him a lot of credit for that. And you have Evan Ingram, and again, with Beckham back, and then Sterling Shepard, now the addition of Barkley, assuming that Barkley can somewhat live up to expectations. But I just don't think Eli's very good. He hasn't been very good for years. Even when they made the playoffs 2 years ago, he really wasn't that great. And I just think he's done, and I think it was a stupid move not to take quarterback at 2, no matter how much you like Barkley. Because, again, he's a running back, and you're giving him $31 million fully guaranteed over the next 4 years. And I know Gurley just got that big contract, but, I mean, he's been playing, in the league for a few years. We don't know if Barkley's going to live up to expectations or not. And I know they desperately needed an impact running back for the last few years now, but at any rate, I don't think Eli can play. I have questions about Pat Shurmur, which I'll get to in a second, but I just don't think Eli's that great, even with the addition of these weapons. We'll have to see about Saquon Barkley. I know one of the questions with him is, for as amazing of a player as he is and great of a playmaker as he is, he had some issues as far as yards after contact and things like that. But at any rate, I'm just wondering if Eli's going to hold him back, and if the Giants are going to what's the word I'm looking for? Greatly regret the decision not to draft a quarterback number 2, especially with Sam Darnold right there, and the Jets take him at 3. So if he turns out to be a star with the Jets, the Giants are especially going to be regretting it for years to come. But again, you really have no plan in place for Eli. If he gets off to a slow start, I don't know. Just not really feeling Eli too much. I think the defense maybe in 2019 is going to be really good, but I think it's still going to be a rebuild. I think the biggest problem, though, and I said I was going to get back to him, is Pat Shurmur. I know there's a lot of people that have kind of been defending Shurmur and saying, look, he won 9 games in 2 years as a Browns head coach. That was back in the 2011 and 2012 seasons. But even though that sounds like a lot compared to what the Browns have done recently, I'm from Northeast Ohio originally. I don't live there anymore, but I'm from Northeast Ohio originally. I'm not a Browns fan, but they were on TV all the time, so I watched them a lot. And I could see exactly what a lot of my friends and relatives would complain about with Pat Shurmur. He was just so painfully predictable as a coach. And, for as good as his offenses have been, in Minnesota and Philadelphia as an offensive coordinator, as a head coach, he had terrible game plans. I don't think he ever let his quarterbacks throw passes over 5 yards, and they're all horizontal. So he had no real offensive plan. For as much as he develops quarterbacks as a coordinator, he couldn't really develop them in Cleveland. And I'm just wondering, is he one of these guys that we see all the time that is a great, career offensive coordinator, career coordinator in general, but just isn't particularly a very good head coach? And this is his second chance, and it'll be a better organization than Cleveland. But nonetheless, I'm just not real sold on him. I just think he wasn't very good in Cleveland. Even with, some of the years have gone by and the opportunity to allow him to kind of learn and try to bounce back. There's a lot of guys that fail as a head coach first time around. And when they get that second chance, maybe they do a little bit better, maybe they don't. But generally, a lot of them don't do any better. Belichick's a big exception, but he's 1 in a million, it seems like. So, I don't think Pat Shurmur is really the future for the Giants. And the fact that, even though I really like Kyle Lauletta from Richmond, who took in the 4th round, even though I like him a lot, again, he's just a 4th round pick. So, the Giants may not feel that committed to him long term, and they might end up using a 1st round pick on a quarterback, possibly even as early as next year. Right now, the quarterback class for 2019 doesn't look particularly good. So I just don't really think Shurmur's a guy, he's, regardless of what he says, I'm sure deep down he kind of feels like he's stuck with Eli. Even with the weapons, I just think he's been done for a few years, and I don't think he's going to get better. He played that heavy dink and duck kind of West Coast offense under McAdoo, so it's not going to be like a dramatically different offense than what he was playing in now that Shurmur's there. But I don't know. I'm not liking the combo of Eli and Shurmur. Switching to a new defensive front, going to the 3-4, that's going to take a little bit of time to figure things out. And you've got a couple of teams in the division that aren't going to make life easy on you. So I think they go 5-11. I think 5-11 for the Giants. And we'll see down the road, if Kyle Lauletta pans out. Dave Gettleman, the way he's building this team, there definitely is some promise long term. But again, a lot of that comes down to quarterback. A lot of it does come down to the head coach. And again, I'm not sure about Shurmur. But I'll go 5-11 with the Giants. Like I said, 7-9 with the Redskins, 9-7 with the Cowboys, and then 12-4 with the Eagles. So really, any of those teams is capable of having a winning season. And the division could be a lot better than what I'm predicting. But ultimately, I just think there's just so many flaws with the Redskins and the Giants. Cowboys, not only are there the flaws, but there's the distractions like we've become accustomed to. So yeah, I think the Eagles run away with the division, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how the division evolves in the next 2 or 3 years. But yeah, I think this will be kind of a year where they're kind of the NFC least a little bit. But we'll see what happens. Maybe there'll be 3 teams with a losing record. Maybe Dallas ends up with a losing record as well. But we'll see how it goes. But yeah, continue to go to thesugarhuddle.com. Continue to check out the articles. Next week I'll be previewing the AFC East. And have a video for you at the end of the week, but continue to go to the website and check things out. I'm going to continue to post videos, divisional previews, and then as we get closer to the season, as the season starts, and I'll try to do a few videos a week if I can. But yeah, go to sugarhuddle.com. So thanks.